When Japan's empire stretched across Asia, few imagined its daughters would ever face captivity. They served as nurses, clerks, and communication aides, told their duty was sacred and surrender was forbidden. But the tide of war spares no believer. By 1944, Allied forces were closing in on the Pacific Islands. Japanese medical units and auxiliaries were left behind as the Imperial Army withdrew. What followed was confusion, fear, and the slow collapse of everything they had been taught to honor. On Saipan, Guam, and Luzon, the first female prisoners emerged from caves and burnt hospitals. Many carried the wounded, others clutched torn flags. To them, survival already felt like betrayal. American soldiers expected resistance or suicide. Instead, they found silence. Women who bowed their heads and waited for execution that never came. Their surrender was an act beyond shame. They were moved to improvised compounds, surrounded by barbed wire under the open sun. Their uniforms were stripped of insignia, their names replaced by numbers. Even language was forbidden, replaced by gestures and orders barked in English. Among them were military nurses who had once operated field hospitals in Burma and the Philippines. They had treated soldiers on battlefields and watched them die for an emperor they would never see again. Now they tended each other's wounds in silence. The Allies fed them, questioned them, and kept their distance. They were an enigma, the enemy's women trapped between fear and discipline. Some guards felt pity, others mistrust. Reports from U.S. and Australian camps described them as quiet, obedient, emotionally detached. They rarely spoke unless ordered. Some refused food for days, convinced that capture erased their right to live. Not all were soldiers. Among them were civilian nurses and clerks who had been forced to follow the army. They were categorized as POWs, yet treated as curiosities of war, proof that Japan's myths had finally broken. When interrogated, they revealed little, not out of loyalty, but because there was nothing left to tell. Their only secret was the shame they could not escape. At night, prayers drifted through the camps, low, steady, whispered to an emperor who would never hear them. "We did not die," one diary read, "and that is our sin." Some women attempted suicide with wire or broken glass, their captors stopping them only to patch the wounds again. The will to die remained stronger than the instinct to live. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, many of these women still hadn't heard the news. For them, the war had not ended. It had simply changed form. They would soon learn that captivity was only the beginning. The return home would be colder than any prison. The camps were surrounded by fences that glinted under the tropical sun. To the guards, they were ordinary barriers. To the women within, they were lines between the living and the forgotten. Days followed a rhythm of inspection, labor, and silence. Food arrived in metal tins, water in barrels that smelled of rust. The monotony dulled the mind, but not the memory of what they had lost. Inside the compounds, the women built order out of nothing. They cleaned, wrote lists, and whispered the emperor's name like a ritual. Discipline became a way to stay human. Letters were written but never sent. Some folded prayers into the seams of their blankets. Others buried them beneath the dirt floors. Each act of hope was a quiet rebellion against oblivion. Allied officers sometimes visited, clipboards in hand, noting behavior and morale. To them, the prisoners were data points in a post-war study. To the prisoners, they were reminders of humiliation measured. The female guards, often nurses or volunteers from the Allied ranks, treated them cautiously. Curiosity replaced hatred. Pity replaced fear. Yet every exchange reminded both sides that compassion was dangerous. Some women were transferred to medical compounds to assist Allied doctors. Their skill was undeniable. One American medic wrote, "They work with the calm of saints, but their eyes never lift." For others, captivity brought sickness that the mind could not mend. Malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion spread quickly in the heat. Few cried out. Stoicism had become armor. When the Red Cross arrived in early 1945, it found women barely recognizable from their enlistment photos. They had become shadows of soldiers, disciplined even in despair. The organization demanded better treatment, cleaner water, and proper documentation. Commanders complied, not from mercy, but from fear of scrutiny. The women thanked them with silent bows they did not mean. In the evenings, they gathered to tell stories of home, cherry blossoms, festivals, mothers' hands washing rice. The past became their refuge, the only place where they were still daughters. Some drew on scraps of paper with charcoal, sketching Japan from memory, its mountains, temples, and rivers. Others etched the same symbols onto tin cups, desperate to leave proof they had existed. The guards often mistook their silence for obedience. They never understood that the silence was not submission. It was survival. In that stillness, the war continued in another form. A quiet, enduring fight to remember who they were before the world took their names. By mid-1945, the camps had become instruments of study, as much as confinement. Allied intelligence officers viewed the captured Japanese women as keys to understanding an empire's mind. Their goal was not cruelty, but comprehension. The interrogations were formal, clinical, and persistent. Translators mediated every word, yet meaning was always lost between shame and pride. When asked about loyalty, the women often replied, "We were never asked to choose." One American officer described them as machines of faith. Their posture never broke, even when their voices trembled. It was not defiance. It was the residue of indoctrination, too deep to unlearn. Questions often drifted toward the emperor, the army, and the myth of surrender. The women answered cautiously, fearing their words might dishonor families back home. For them, truth and silence had become the same thing. A few prisoners tried to explain the code of Bushido, not as a belief, but as a burden. "We were taught dying was simpler than living," one said quietly. Her interrogator wrote those words twice in his notebook. Some guards, curious rather than cruel, began to speak gently during interviews. They offered tea, cigarettes, and patience. For a few moments, the line between enemy and human blurred. Despite this, the interrogations took a toll. The women aged visibly, faces thin, eyes hollow, backs straight only from habit. Survival had turned into a performance rehearsed each morning. A nurse from Manila named Fumiko kept a hidden journal written in broken English. "They ask of war," she wrote, "but not of hunger, not of night dreams." Her words would never reach Japan. Some were shown newsreels of the Pacific War, meant to break their pride. Instead, they stared blankly, unable to recognize the ruins as their homeland. A few wept quietly, not from fear, but from understanding. By August, as atomic clouds rose over Japan, whispers of surrender reached the camps. The women didn't celebrate. They simply stopped moving for a long time. For them, peace sounded like defeat pronounced softly. The interrogations ended suddenly after Japan's formal surrender. Many officers shook hands with the prisoners before leaving. The gestures were polite, but heavy with the guilt of victory. In the following days, the women were left in limbo. Not prisoners, not yet free. Bureaucracy moved slower than memory. Their eyes followed every Allied truck, wondering if it carried their names. When the order for repatriation finally arrived, they felt neither relief nor joy, Home was now an idea blurred by distance and shame. None knew what awaited them beyond the sea. As the gates opened, they stepped out, not as soldiers or captives, but as survivors without a country that wanted them. The real interrogation, they would soon learn, had only just begun. The ships that carried them home were slow, gray, and silent. Each woman stood at the railings, watching the horizon tremble between sea and sky. Behind them lay barbed wire. Ahead, uncertainty. The journey took weeks across the Pacific, through storms and memories. Allied medics monitored them, recording temperatures and rations like routine maintenance of broken machinery. Not one spoke of the future. When they reached Japan, the ports were ruins, ash, silence, and hunger. The flags they had once saluted were gone, replaced by the white cloth of surrender. It felt less like arrival, more like awakening into a nightmare. Officials processed their return with clinical precision. Each was questioned, photographed, and marked repatriated personnel. Their files carried the cold label that would haunt them for decades. Former prisoner of war. Families met them with forced smiles or didn't come at all. Mothers wept in private. Fathers turned away. For a society taught that surrender was sin, these women embodied a wound Japan didn't want to see. Neighbors whispered behind doors, calling them those who lived instead of died. Employers refused to hire them, saying their presence brought bad luck. The empire had fallen, but its shadow still judged them. One nurse, Haruko, returned to her hometown only to find her name erased from the local memorial. "You are not dead," she was told. "So you do not belong?" She left that night and never went back. Many survivors retreated into silence. Some married quietly. Others moved to distant cities under false names. The war had taught them obedience. Now it taught them invisibility. Government aid never arrived. Their pensions were denied because their service, officials said, ended in capture. They were ghosts in their own country, living proof that survival had a price. Those who tried to tell their stories met disbelief. Women soldiers? Captured? The public would say. That never happened. So the truth stayed buried, one unspoken wound among thousands. A few gathered in secret after the war, nurses, clerks, and medics, bound by the silence they shared. They met in small tea houses and left flowers at temples for the dead. No one else came. Western reporters occasionally sought interviews, calling them forgotten victims. The women refused most requests. They did not want pity, only to be remembered as human. By the 1950s, most faded into anonymity. Some taught children, others worked in hospitals again, caring for a new generation that would never know their names. The nation moved forward, but they could not, and so, while Japan rebuilt its cities from ashes, its forgotten daughters rebuilt their souls in silence, a quiet resistance that history would overlook for half a century. Years passed, but the war never truly ended for them. Each night carried the echo of boots, the smell of medicine, and the faces of men they could not save. Memory became both companion and punishment. In post-war Japan, silence was survival. Speaking of captivity invited suspicion, even ridicule. The women learned to smile when others mentioned honor, as if the word still had meaning. Their diaries became their only refuge. Written in cramped script on worn paper, they recorded everything: the hunger, the shame, the fragile kindness of strangers. Most burned them before death to spare their families. A few refused to let memory die. One former nurse, Yuki Tanabe, kept her field notebook hidden inside a medicine chest. When found years later, it read, "To live was harder than to die, but I chose to live." Japan's new generation, raised on prosperity, rarely asked questions about the women who came back in silence. Their history textbooks spoke of soldiers, not nurses, of battles, not captivity. When historians from abroad sought testimony, they found walls of humility and fear. The survivors bowed, declined, and said, "The war is finished." But their eyes said otherwise. Even decades later, the stigma lingered. In some villages, the word POW could still close doors. These women lived entire lives under that invisible brand, unspoken but always felt. In private moments, they wrote letters addressed to their fallen comrades. None were ever mailed. They signed them simply, "Your sister who survived." Psychologists who later studied their cases called it survivor's discipline. It was not trauma as the West understood it, but a duty to carry the burden with dignity. Even grief had to be orderly. A few found solace in service again, volunteering in hospitals that treated American veterans. They spoke little English, yet their hands knew the same work, binding wounds that war never stopped making. Time blurred enemies into faces and uniforms into memory. Forgiveness was never spoken, yet somehow it lingered in their quiet gestures. A bow, a kind word, a steady hand. As the 1960s came, a handful began to speak publicly. Old newspapers published small interviews under distant headlines. Former nurse recalls camp life. Few readers finished the article. One of them said simply, "We were trained to serve the emperor. Instead, we served humanity." Her words summed up an entire generation's hidden heroism. They had entered the war as instruments of loyalty and left it as witnesses to its cruelty, women who carried the weight of memory so the world could forget in peace. When Japan rose from its ashes, rebuilding cities and industries, the women who had returned from captivity were left behind. Their stories did not fit the new nation's pride. Victory was measured in silence, not truth. The government spoke of sacrifice, of soldiers who died for honor, but it had no place for those who lived through surrender. Living, for them, was still the wrong kind of courage. Even their pensions were quietly denied. Non-combat personnel, officials wrote. The phrase erased years of blood, fear, and discipline behind barbed wire. To survive meant adapting once again. Many worked as nurses, seamstresses, or teachers, masking the scars of captivity behind calm professionalism. They learned to smile when others spoke of heroes. Some former POWs kept small keepsakes from the camps, a tin cup, a Red Cross patch, a scrap of English writing. To others, such objects were unbearable reminders and were thrown into the sea. As Japan celebrated economic miracles, they remained invisible. Television showed soldiers returning home, but never the women who had crossed the same seas under shame. History had room only for victory. In rural towns, rumors followed them. People whispered that foreign soldiers had shown them kindness, an accusation disguised as gossip. Each lie buried them deeper under guilt that was not theirs. The few who married did so quietly. Husbands often learned the truth years later, and most never spoke of it again. Their silence was a pact of survival between shame and love. By the 1970s, scholars began searching archives for missing wartime testimonies. What they found were fragments, unsigned reports, censored diaries, and photos labeled only female internees. The women's identities had been deleted on purpose. Foreign journalists eventually uncovered the stories. Western headlines called them Japan's forgotten prisoners. But in Japan, their names remained unknown, whispered only in academic footnotes. Some survivors finally agreed to interviews, now old and unafraid of losing anything more. Their voices trembled but never broke. They spoke not of cruelty, but of the cost of silence. One woman told an interviewer, "We waited for our country to remember us, but it remembered only the dead. Her words carried more truth than any textbook written since. They were patriots who never stopped loving the land that disowned them. Even as their bodies weakened, their loyalty remained unshaken, but not toward the emperor anymore, only toward humanity. By the time the world began to listen, most of them were gone. Victory had forgotten them, but memory had not. Their absence became their final act of defiance. By the late 1980s, a quiet revolution began among Japan's forgotten women. Aging and unafraid, a few survivors decided to break their silence. They understood that memory, once spoken, could outlive shame itself. Meetings were held in small Tokyo apartments where frail hands unfolded faded photographs from the camps. Some women still wore the same rosaries or hairpins they had hidden for decades. Their voices, trembling yet deliberate, turned pain into testimony. One nurse, now nearly 70, spoke to a journalist for the first time. "We were not heroes. We were not victims," she said. "We were witnesses to the collapse of faith." Her story would never appear in school books, but it spread quietly among those who still wanted truth. At an international symposium in Osaka, a translator read excerpts from several diaries written by female POWs. The audience sat in stunned silence as words like honor, hunger, and forgiveness echoed through the hall. For the first time, Japan listened without interruption. Western scholars began publishing their findings, restoring names erased by post-war bureaucracy. Among them were medics from Borneo, nurses from Guam, and clerks captured in Manila. The footnotes of history were finally becoming faces again. A handful of survivors appeared on television interviews. They spoke calmly, without bitterness, their stories stripped of sentiment. "War," one woman said, "is not only what men do to each other, it is what nations do to their daughters." As the truth spread, the public response was divided. Younger generations expressed sympathy, while older veterans dismissed them as traitors who had survived by chance. The nation that had forgotten them now argued over whether they deserved remembrance. One former POW named Keiko Tanaka placed a single candle at Yasukuni Shrine, though her name was never engraved there. "I do not ask for forgiveness," she said softly. "I ask only that we stop pretending we were never women in this war." Historians began comparing their experiences to other POW accounts: American, British, Filipino, and Chinese. The similarities were haunting: hunger, humiliation, endurance, and the quiet persistence to live another day. Humanity's suffering spoke in the same language. Documentaries followed, featuring grainy black and white photos of the camps. Narrators described the stillness of their faces, the discipline of their posture. Even decades later, those images seemed to hold the silence of the entire war. Despite new recognition, most survivors remained humble. They refused medals or honors, saying such gestures arrived too late. "We did not survive to be honored," one said. "We survived so the lie would not be complete." Some visited the old sites of their captivity: overgrown fields, rusted fences, and sunken bunkers. They stood quietly, not in mourning, but in remembrance of the selves they had left behind. The past was not a wound anymore, only a mirror. The interviews, diaries, and photographs collected during these years became invaluable archives. What had begun as whispers turned into evidence, carefully cataloged for future generations. History was finally listening, even if it had come too late. And so, after decades of silence, the women who once hid in the shadows reclaimed their voices. Their truth was not shouted, but spoken softly. Yet it echoed louder than all the victories men had ever claimed. With every story uncovered, Japan faced a question it had long avoided. What was the cost of silence? The nation had moved forward, building skyscrapers and bullet trains, but beneath its progress lingered the ghosts of unspoken truths. These women carried those ghosts within them, long after the rest of the world forgot. Historians found that government archives held no mention of female POWs. Their identities had been intentionally erased, categorized only as missing personnel. The silence was not ignorance, it was design. When confronted, officials offered polite regret but no apology. They called the stories unverified recollections, as if memory could be measured by paperwork. Bureaucracy became the final wall they could not climb. Many survivors died waiting for recognition that never came. Their obituaries listed them as teachers, nurses, mothers, never soldiers or prisoners. The truth was buried twice, once by war, once by peace. In the 1990s, civic groups began collecting testimonies from aging survivors. Each interview felt like rescuing a life from oblivion. They recorded trembling voices, wrinkled hands, and eyes that had seen too much light and too much dark. Western academics published books on the subject, calling it Japan's Hidden Chapter. Some praised the women as heroes. Others criticized the state for neglect. The debate grew louder, but the women themselves had no interest in being symbols. They asked only for acknowledgement, not compensation, not glory. "A name in the record," one said, "is enough." Her sentence, simple and weary, carried the weight of 50 silent years. The few who lived to see their testimonies printed received letters from strangers around the world. Some from former Allied soldiers, others from their children. "We never knew you suffered, too," one message read. "We thought you were the enemy." Television documentaries aired their faces, lined by time but unbroken in spirit. Viewers were struck not by their suffering, but by their composure. They spoke as witnesses, not victims, and that dignity left an indelible mark. Japanese society, still cautious about discussing defeat, began to shift slightly. Students wrote essays about them. Teachers whispered their names during lessons on war ethics. The silence that had once protected the nation now began to feel like betrayal. But even as recognition grew, the survivors faded one by one. Death came quietly. Not as tragedy, but as release. They had carried their burden long enough, and history was finally beginning to carry it for them. At memorials across Japan, flowers appeared anonymously, white chrysanthemums left without notes. No statues, no speeches, just remembrance in its purest form. The women's legacy was humility itself. The silence that once condemned them had become their greatest teacher. Through it, they learned endurance, patience, and the truth that justice does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers. And so, as the century turned, the world began to remember what Japan had tried to forget, that bravery is not always loud, and survival is not always celebrated. Their silence had been their price and their triumph. By the early 2000s, their voices had nearly faded, yet their stories continued to travel. Younger historians, journalists, and descendants began to search for them. Not out of pity, but out of duty. They understood that silence itself was a wound that demanded healing. Digital archives began to appear, containing scanned letters, camp rosters, and fragments of photographs. Faces long blurred by time re-emerged in high resolution. For the first time, the world could look directly into the eyes of women it had forgotten. In classrooms across Japan, some teachers dared to introduce their stories into modern history lessons. Students were stunned to learn that their own grandmother's generation had suffered such hidden trials. The discovery turned curiosity into quiet respect. Filmmakers followed next, capturing testimonies from the few remaining survivors. The documentaries were not grand productions, just dimly lit rooms, trembling voices, and truth spoken plainly. Their power lay in what was not said. As these films aired internationally, viewers wrote messages of sorrow and admiration. Many wondered how the world had celebrated victory while forgetting these women's grief. Empathy began to fill the spaces where history had been silent. In Japan, however, recognition remained hesitant. Politicians avoided the subject, wary of reopening old wounds. But ordinary citizens left white flowers at train stations and memorial sites, gestures that spoke louder than speeches. One historian described the women as echoes of a defeated nation still whispering through its progress. Their endurance became a quiet symbol of truth surviving politics. In their stories, people found the humanity that war had stolen. A few descendants began speaking on their behalf, grandchildren who found letters, uniforms, or old medals hidden in closets. They told the world, "Our grandmothers served with dignity, and history owes them a place among the brave." The phrase female POW slowly shifted from stigma to acknowledgement. Exhibits in Tokyo and Hiroshima displayed their belongings: a nurse's bag, a diary, a pair of worn shoes. Each artifact carried more weight than any medal of valor. As their stories reached Western audiences, comparisons were drawn to women in every nation who had survived occupation, captivity, or silence.